Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Welcome back to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Don's sitting in the host chair today. Alexis is not around, but I'm not alone as we go down this potential branch or a different fork in history. I'm joined today by a guest contributor, actually a former colleague of mine who I'm excited to have on the podcast because Sam and I used to talk history, particularly military history, a lot when we used to work together. So now we get to do it without looking around the corner to see when the boss is going to show up. So that makes it a little bit more exciting, gives us a little more freedom. So I'm happy to have Sam Smith join the podcast today. Sam, good to have you.
Yeah, thanks, Don. I appreciate it. It's good to be here.
Yeah, I appreciate that. By the way, Sam's voice. Sam, you did some disc jockey work back in the day. Do I remember that correctly?
I did. When I first got out of college. I did maybe 7 years of news and entertainment, and then more recently, although not that recent now, I guess, I actually did weather for Impact Weather. So
Yeah, and some of the things that we did, that the company that we, back when it was called that, when we worked together, some of the things that we did that were part of the in the media space when it came to weather. So we did some of the weather updates in the local Houston area. I'd forgotten about that because that was sort of before I joined the company, but was there as part of what's there. So Sam is also a meteorologist as well. So if a weather question comes up in the middle of what we're talking about today, we are well covered. But I know he's an avid student of history, particularly military history. So I wanted to reach out and have Sam join us for this episode here, which is sort of part of a theme that we've had going on or off for the last couple of months, looking at alternatives towards the latter stages of World War II. And so we had a couple of episodes where Brent Frost and Chris Coppola joined us, where we looked at alternatives in the Pacific theater. And I wanted to sort of mirror that with something looking at maybe alternative ways that the war could have ended in the European theater, particularly the war, peace with Germany, and how things could have worked out differently at the end of the war. So that's the fork that we're going to take today, is looking at a different path potentially for the end of the Second World War in terms of the European theater of conflict, and sort of thinking through what the historical what if might be for that. So before we get back into the details of that, we're going to take a quick break here to let you hear from somebody who helps make the podcast possible. And then we'll be back to pick up Sam and I talking about maybe a different end to the World War II European theater.
Would groceries delivered to you in as fast as 1 hour save you a trip to the store? Instacart makes that possible thanks to personal shoppers in your area who hand-select items based on your preferences from the stores you love. And shopping multiple stores is possible on a single order. Instacart picks the freshest produce and even keeps your eggs safe, all while finding everything you usually buy, providing smart suggestions for new items, and even highlighting deals to help you save money. And now you get free delivery on your first order over $35. Let Instacart know we sent you and help support our show by following the link in the show notes. Instacart, groceries delivered in as fast as 1 hour.
Welcome back to A Fork in Time, the Alternate History Podcast. Don again joined today by Sam Smith. So Sam, what we talked about was we're going to look at an alternative end to the war in Europe. And we've decided to use just a lot of different ways you might choose to do this. But we're going to use something that probably is a little bit more familiar even to just casual students of history. If for no other reason, Tom Cruise starred in a movie that sort of featured this. That, I don't know, you want to think that is a good movie or a bad movie, but at least puts it in the popular culture. So what we're going to talk about is the July 20th of 1944, which was a plot by leadership inside of the German military and inside of the German political apparatus to assassinate Adolf Hitler. So we're going to assume that the July 20th plot of 1944 is successful. So what do you think are important things listeners ought to probably know about that plot, Sam, in terms of what it was? And I guess we can talk a little bit about the historical what did before we get over in the historical what if.
Well, of course, it was Tom Cruise's best movie, I think. So, uh, the plot itself was not the first one. That there's something about Hitler, whatever you think about psychopath, murdering, bad guy, he led a charmed life. He really did. I
Yeah.
mean, there's the apocryphal story of the British soldier in World War I that could have shot him and didn't. So there's something about Hitler that lived a lot of times when he shouldn't have. So they had tried several times to kill him, and von Stauffenberg was, of course, a member of the old Prussian aristocracy, and most of the people involved in the plot were too. And they had this idea that Hitler was just not for them anymore. They started out fanatical Nazis and decided, no, this is a bad idea. And of course, losing the war had a lot to do with that, I think.
Right.
The situation, if we can take a sidebar for just a second, the situation was pretty dire by July of 44 for the Germans. The Russians had begun their Operation Bagration, the huge destruction of Army Group Center, which was masterfully done. And of course, the Germans didn't have much left by then. And the Russians had lots of stuff. So Germans were completely outnumbered and burned out. And the Russians made it all the way to the Polish border that summer. They're also in the West, of course, D-Day had occurred the month before, and they were just about to break through with Operation Cobra, I believe it was, that allowed Patton to cut through the hedgerows and break out toward Paris. So that was in the process of happening. So the German general staff knew that they weren't going to win this.
Right.
So
They knew it was now not a question of if, it was a question of when and how this was
Right.
actually going to take place. Yeah, any hopes of throwing back an Allied invasion like the D-Day invasion, or of having a different outcome on the Eastern Front. You and I were talking a little bit off podcast just about I think how sometimes we as Americans don't think about the war in the East quite as much, obviously, as we do, in D-Day and the war in France and the liberation. But the tide had definitely turned back in the other direction with the Soviets making advances on the Eastern Front as well.
Very true. And so I don't know if you wanted to get into the elements of the actual plot itself.
Yeah, I think it's helpful because then it'll help us understand, if it had succeeded, who was involved and what were they even trying to accomplish, right?
Well, von Stauffenberg was the leader pretty much, and he wasn't even a general, but he was a decorated war veteran, and he had like one hand and half an arm, and I mean, he had been wounded, and of course that makes you a hero in Nazi Germany. So he could get in and out where he wanted, and he got posted to what they call the Home Army, which was basically the replacement and apparatus for the Wehrmacht, German army. So he had access to the headquarters, and Hitler from time to time had conferences where he brought in all the generals and field marshals, and they would discuss strategy. So he goes to this place called the Wolf's Lair, which used to be in what was called Prussia, still was then before the Russians got there, not too long after that. And he had 2 bombs in a briefcase, and he only had time to arm one of them in the restroom, which was another big factor. If he'd maybe armed both of them, that he might have actually killed Hitler.
Right.
More charmed life, right? So, because somebody came into the restroom and said, Colonel, they're starting the meeting, so he had to stop, and he had 1 bomb. So
But by the way, and as well portrayed, I think, probably as accurately as it can be in the movie Valkyrie, is here's a guy who is injured, who essentially only has function in one hand, trying to do
Yeah,
this action in the restroom as well, right?
yeah, it took him a little longer than most people to arm bombs, right? So yeah, it's true. So they go into the conference room, and another thing, another one of these weird things. Normally, they had it in a sealed concrete bunker, but it was hot that day in Prussia in July the 20th. So hot for them in like probably the 80s, you know.
Right. But not Houston or present Southern California hot, but yeah,
Right,
hot
right.
for there.
And so they moved it to a conference room that had windows on the surface so they could let a little breeze blow through. They did not have air conditioning, of course. So the difference between a bomb going off in a sealed concrete bunker and one going off in a room with open windows is a lot.
Right.
I mean, in a concrete bunker, the explosive force is reflected back and forth across the walls several times probably, and it just turns anybody in there into mush. So that was the original plan.
Right. And as I understand it, plus I think this is also, again, relying upon Tom Cruise for history, which I'm willing to go there a little bit because it does portray it. Is
it was
also
pretty accurate?
Yeah, and I think they made an effort for that. I don't want to belittle that. Is also the placement of the briefcase up against a table leg or part of the conference table, where the conference table also then blocks the direct impact of the blast. Then, as you mentioned, without it being in a sealed, contained space, the outcome, the further impact of the blast, in an more open space versus the closed, you end up with the one bomb instead of two, and the one bomb doesn't do everything you would even expect the one bomb to be able to do.
Yeah, exactly. Another one of those things where one of the generals, I guess it was, he bumped it with his foot, so he pushed it with his foot onto the opposite end of the table leg, and got it out of the way. It was an innocent thing. Anybody could have done that, you know. So
Yeah.
it was
And,
because
and
by then Stauffenberg was on his way out,
right,
trying to get away from it.
The skillfully placed phone call getting him out of getting out of harm's way had happened. And of course, Hitler survives the attempt, although he is injured. I mean, I think there's a famous picture of his trouser legs that were singed, just to give an idea of how this actually happened.
Right.
In reading some of the historical stuff there, he suffers a perforated eardrum. Given his proximity to the bomb, given everything else, the injuries are basically inconsequential.
His arm was injured as well. I know he never used his left arm much after that too.
Right. So again, that brings home the point of how close this was to succeeding as well. Despite all the things that you just mentioned there, he wasn't unscathed, which is an indication of just how close this plot came to actually succeeding in terms of killing him.
It almost worked. Yeah.
And so my understanding, again, I think this is also well portrayed in the movie, is that part of the advantage that this group of conspirators, and it was a fairly large group, you'll see a list of who was noted to be either aware of the plot or involved in the plot. That's an interesting thing, particularly when they choose to execute so many of them so quickly, so you sort of don't get a chance to know what happens. Is part of the reason or the advantage that this group has was that there were, again, this Valkyrie, which is what the movie is named after, was the name of an exercise that they were going to use essentially as cover to take control of the governmental and military apparatus. In other words, it wasn't just, okay, we've killed Hitler, now what are we going to do? They had a plan for how they were actually going to seize and maintain control, at least in the immediate near term, after Hitler's death, to take advantage of the assassination, to put themselves in a position to be able to be successful in the coup effort.
Yeah, and it was, as I understand it, it was their backup communication plan, where if the head of the HQ was cut off, and which it kind of was for a little while, that they could still run the war from Berlin through Valkyrie, through the backup communications program.
And so having that available, because one of the things that you see, to the extent you think about assassinations or particularly military coups in history, be they older or be they modern, okay, it's one thing to actually assassinate the head general or assassinate the president or decapitate the head of state. It's another thing than to actually gain and maintain control of whatever it is you need to gain and maintain control of to actually be successful after you've done that act.
Right. So the military in that situation would have to be the ones that take things over and hold things together.
Right.
And,
And most of the conspirators, most of those who were involved in the plot were in key military positions that would have allowed them to do so. So again, their goal apparently was to, as you said, they've already realized that it's inevitable that the war is going to be lost. So if the war is going to be lost, we want to come to some resolution of the war that's not going to be what the real timeline was, the ultimate defeat and surrender. And so now we can slip over, and now I think we did an excellent job there, and you did an excellent job, same, of covering the historical what did. Now we can sort of slip to the historical what if. So if they are successful, we talked a little bit about what their goals are. Their goals are to have a different outcome to the war. I guess what's the first thing that pops into your mind as being the likely outcome if they had been successful in? We're going to assume two things here. In Hitler's death, but also being able to actually use this communications plan, this exercise that would have been the cover for seizing control of the government. We're going to assume that both of those things worked as planned. We already know from history and reality nothing ever works as planned, but we're going to give them that assumption at this point. So let's assume that they do that. What's the first thing in your mind that's a major, what changes? What's the first thing we encounter coming down the what if?
The military situation, I just don't see it changing all that much. Even if they broadcast to the world, Hitler's dead, stop shooting at us, we want to talk peace. I don't know that it would change that much for at least some of the allies. And the Western allies perhaps would have agreed to a ceasefire and an occupation of some sort. If the Germans had made serious peace efforts, but I don't think the Russians would have stopped. There was too much blood over on that side of the war and they had it. In addition to great equipment and good generals by then, led by Marshal Zhukov, of course, they just would not have stopped. They had blood in their eyes. So,
right.
And then it would have been a question of, do the Western allies let the Russians take over even more of Europe or what?
Right. So just to draw, I actually have pulled up on my screen in front of me just to remind myself sort of where the battle lines are as of the middle of July. So essentially where we are here. D-Day had been successful, 6-7 weeks before. As you pointed out, they haven't quite broken out, out of the hedgerow country. The Operation Cobra, Patton's fame. I think about the movie Patton here. Sadly, when I think Patton, I see George C. Scott too often instead of the real guy in my head.
I do too. He did a great job in that one.
But I think about that famous scene from the movie Patton where Carl Malden, again, I see Carl Malden instead of Omar Bradley too, which is also, that's maybe even more sad in some ways. But it's that famous thing where he's describing the plan. How he's going to swing around and use maneuver, use speed. Instead of pushing mile by mile, we're going to do this big maneuver where we're going to swing around and go. And it's a famous. It's not like you need some crazy old cavalry commander to lead that group, and and he says, yeah, I've been thinking about that for a while. We're pulling you out of we're getting you out of the penalty box now so you can go and do that, George. But this is before that's happened, but this is on the verge of that happening. And so while there's not that
long either, I mean, it was before the end of July, they were on the move.
Right. And so if you look at a map, which is what I'm looking at now on July 15th, again, 5 days before the July 20th plot, is that you see that there's just barely a toehold for the Allied forces there, essentially right off of the Normandy landing, and a little bit of move into that area. And it looks like it's very small, but that's misleading. That small contingent there that's going to change dramatically very quickly. And if you look on the southern part, I think the other part of the war that, at least I do, I don't know if it's true of all Americans, we tend to forget the Italian and the campaigns in the Mediterranean. By this point, Allied forces have made it up about half of the way, slightly above half of the way of the boot of Italy. And so that is progressing with the advance from the south. And then, of course, you've already mentioned the fact that the Soviets now are beginning to move into Poland, and it's no longer a defensive Soviet Union defending against the German invasion launched with Barbarossa, but it's now an offensive action by the Soviets that are beginning to push back into Eastern Europe. So this snapshot, if you will, on July 20th is a little misleading in terms of, and again, you mentioned the German military leadership. They knew where this was headed. They could read the tea leaves. And so they knew that if there was any time to do it, it was now, because they still were in occupation of the vast majority of France. The vast majority of Eastern Europe is still under German control. That's going to change very, very, very quickly.
Yes. And as long as they still had a country, then that was the time to do it. Yeah.
Because literally, it's it's going to take a little bit more. You're going to move into the winter of 1944. The famous the German General McAuliffe, responding to nuts to the surrender of the Battle of the Bulge. The last little offensive there. That still lies ahead. But again, that's also still, yes, there was that, but that was the last hurrah. So
by the way, my dad was there.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, he was in a engineer combat battalion, and he wasn't in Bastogne, but he was there in Belgium.
Oh, wow.
And he said that was the coldest he'd ever been in his life.
I've certainly seen the movie portrayals of that and have read the accounts of that. And, war is hell, just because war is hell. But we tend to forget that soldiers are exposed to all the elements when they're out in the middle of that war too. I think that's the thing that I forget when you're watching black and white footage of a documentary on TV. It's not like there's a thing over in the corner that shows you the current temperature of what you're looking at. It's just
right.
It's neutral, right? It's 72 comfortable degrees here in my living room while I'm watching these people shoot at each other, while it may have been 95 that day or 35 that day or below.
Well, it was unusual. It was an unusually cold winter that year because it actually got below zero in Belgium, and that just doesn't happen all that often with the climate they have. So anyway, get back to the plot here.
But see, you have the capability of talking about that. You're a meteorologist, Sam.
Let me tell you about the weather station they planted on Newfoundland. Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah. So again, the timing of this is, most historians assume that what they wanted to do was sue for peace under a different, obviously, set of conditions, where they still occupied what they occupied, were in a position, as you said, they still had a country that was still together at that point. So the common thinking is, or I guess the more optimistic version of this alternative timeline is, they say, hey, as you said, hey, we've killed Hitler. We'd sort of like to end this thing. Can we come to some understanding and let bygones be bygones? I think that's sort of the rosy picture of what would have happened here. You've suggested the Soviets are probably not as willing to go along with that. And my suggestion is that the United States and Britain are probably not willing to just say, oh, okay, yeah, we'll let you stay. Okay, you're bad. It probably is not just going to be an easy resolution, even if there's a willingness to accept a resolution. That's my take anyway.
Well, yeah, I think you might be right, because then there's another factor involved here too. The plotters, the conspirators, did not plan to hold free elections. Okay, they were going to be basically a German junta, and they had everything all picked as to who was going to do what, and they may have considered it an interim government, but they had, as far as I can tell, had no plans to become a democracy or a republic, and that would have sat really hard with the Western allies, I think. They,
Right.
you know, we're gonna let you just have a different military dictatorship. You know, come on, guys. So
Right. It sort of would have set up, okay, yes, this ends World War II. Now, when are we going to have World War III, right? Or a different
yeah,
version, or a different version of at least a European war. In my mind, but listeners of the podcast have heard me say this. My understanding that I've come to now, and my sense of how I keep the big sweep of history in place is, yes, there was a World War I and there was a World War II, and they are distinct events. But don't forget the connection between the two of them. The seeds of
yeah.
World War II are born in even the peace and the end of World War One,
Oh
and
yeah.
very much how the Cold War is born in the end of World War II. Even if you have as you say, just a different military authoritarian dictatorship inside of Germany. Now we're saying in late summer of 1944, with hostilities coming to an end, you probably have just set yourself up for whatever is going to happen next, and then it just becomes a question of figuring out what is going to happen next.
Yeah, very true. That I think most of Hitler's, if not all of Hitler's early moves in the late 30s were to undo the Versailles Treaty,
Right.
to take back what they took from Germany, right? So
Yeah, the way that I see so many things symbolically. That's just the way my head works. Is I know that when they are successful, they being the Germans are successful in having France capitulate, Hitler goes out of his way, is my understanding, to find the exact rail car that had been used where Germany had to, to indicate their capitulation to Allied forces in World War I. Goes out of his way to find that car, and that's the rail car that France surrenders in World War II in. So just by that very fact, you understand, okay, that's a little bit of what's going on here. It's not.
I think they had put the rail car. I don't know where it was. I forget where it was when the armistice was signed, but they had moved it to Versailles. So it was kind of a little monument kind of a thing.
Right.
So he knew right where it was.
Yeah, and the fact that he felt compelled to do that, again, to me explains a lot about what was going on, motivation and psychologically, beyond the obvious things that are tough to explain because of genocide and just generally being a madman. But in terms of understanding what some of the the long-standing political motivations were there, I think that demonstrates a lot.
Yeah, and then they blew it up. So
Right.
yeah, in your face,
Yeah, can't do this again, right?
Right.
Or sadly, we'd have the rail car that just goes everywhere when somebody needs to surrender. It'd be like the designated surrender rail car.
Well, the Missouri is still around,
Yeah, there you go. There you go. So again, we may have chased that rabbit too far, so we'll let it get into the brush there. But but the concept is, if you think that this would have just simply been an okay, and as you said, it's just okay, we're okay with this being this form of leadership. The fact that it probably would have had there would have been conditions in the Allies' acceptance of whatever surrender would have happened here, I guess, is the point. And so then one of the questions about the what if, or what are likely things that would have been acceptable. Let's start with the United States and Britain, but then also talk about what would have been acceptable potentially to the Soviets. So we're going to get some form of ceasefire, peaceful settlement here. What would have been the bargaining chips at the table?
Well, I think first off, I think we would have insisted that Germany pull out all forces outside of the original borders of Germany. So they would have to evacuate France and Belgium and all of the other countries they took. Now, there's where the rub occurs, because the Germans might have pulled back from France and Belgium and the Netherlands and Denmark and all that, but they thought that the Rhineland and the Sudetenland and other bits of Europe were German. So when they took that over in the late 30s, it's like, we're just reclaiming Germany here,
That's why the term annexation is used to describe that, because it was before the occupation formally as a result of military action. But yeah, the Sudetenland being a good example of that, right?
Right. Yeah, I don't think they may not have wanted to give up Austria, So
So the first thing that would be on the table at this peace conference with this newly installed, I think it's okay to call him a hunter,
Yeah.
the newly installed authoritarian leadership, at least of the now Hitler removed Germany, would be over
Hmm.
where these lines ought to be.
Right. So there would have been some big arguments. And of course, the Western allies and the Russians, you have to include them on the pressure on this, would have had the bargaining chip, so to speak. It's like, okay, you don't want to give them up. We'll just keep fighting. We'll just take the rest of your country by force.
Right.
So, yeah.
And so that sort of covers the West. On the East, we have, as you already mentioned here, Soviet forces are now moving into Poland, but they haven't made it into the rest of what we traditionally think of as being what will become the Eastern Bloc countries in the real timeline.
Yeah, Warsaw Pact people.
Right. So the assumption would be there. Obviously, I think the Soviets would also have the equal concern about you're going to be contained back to whatever your borders were, pre-conflict. We're going antebellum with the borders here. Is they certainly would not have stood for German occupation of Poland, German occupation of, again, many of those other Eastern European countries. Their motivation, though, probably would be, much as it was after the war and in the Cold War, a different reason for not wanting German forces to occupy there, right? They wanted that buffer between Germany and themselves.
Yeah, and I think the Russians, well, as you said, would not have allowed any Germans in Poland, even though the Germans had really, their intent was to colonize Poland. And they had done quite a bit of that. They had moved a lot of Poles out, and of course they got rid of all the Jewish Poles, or were in the process of trying to, and so they considered that part of Germany now. But of course, and it used to be all of East Prussia had become Poland after World War I. So they didn't want to give that back. Of course, once again, the Soviets could have said, fine, we'll just take it ourselves.
Right.
So
the bargaining power of this new Germany is obviously limited by the fact that what we've already talked about, the inevitability of they're going to lose the war. And so, yes, you may be able to negotiate a better end than full occupation of your country, but the likelihood that you're going to get the borders drawn where you're going to draw them, I think it's probably unlikely. Would you agree with that, Sam? Or
yeah, I'd say it's highly unlikely they would get anything outside of the original post World War I borders of Germany, and even then, it was iffy.
Okay.
Because then, when in a situation like this, other countries seize their opportunities. So if they could seize a little piece here and there, they probably would.
Right. I think that's certainly true in a lot of different ways. So under that scenario, let's just, again, it's wonderful thing about what if history is we can decide what it is, and that's what it is in the what if timeline. We don't have to consult with anybody else. But so let's assume that we go back to essentially, again, antebellum borders. These essentially the borders or the outlines of Europe, maybe with some small changes, cosmetic changes, logical changes. Probably a question about, again, as we talked about Sudetenland, what part of that might Germany have been able to maintain, just so that they feel like the Allies give them something to come away from, the table
you can keep the Rhineland, okay? Because we just had that for the Versailles Treaty anyway to rape Germany for the reparations. So
right, exactly. So okay, you have a case that goes back, further on that, so we'll grant that kind of deal. The thing that pops into my head, and I think about this because the way things that played on the real timeline in the Pacific theater, is there some form of, and I guess there was a little bit of this after the First World War, what's the status of the Allies allowing Germany to maintain a military? What restrictions might be placed upon allowing them to still have the ability to resume hostilities inside of these, let's say, again, the borders that are agreed finally because of all the reasons we've talked about are essentially, okay, do over, we're going back now. If you get to that, are they allowed to maintain a military?
Not at first. I think it would have been an occupation of some sort initially, just like we did in Japan after the surrender. So I think, and this would be a surrender. Let's make no bones about it. It's not so much a peace treaty as it is a surrender, because both sides, or all the allies, had said this is an unconditional surrender situation. I think they would have stuck with that. So, so first it's an occupation. Then eventually, I think, following the model that we implemented after World War II originally, they would have allowed a Bundeswehr to form just as a self-defense force, with strict precautions against new Nazis taking over, that kind of thing. Maybe no former high-level Nazis in command, that kind of thing. Although they actually did, there were a few in the 50s in the Bundeswehr that actually served as Nazi commanders, but not too many. I don't know how they decided, well, you're not good, but you're okay.
Right. How do you vet that, right, effectively after the war? Know that you're not going to be 100% in it, no matter what means that you use. So it's always fraught with difficulty, right?
Yeah, I know a good example is Adolf Galland, the German air ace. He was a tremendous pilot and had multiple victories, mostly in the Eastern Front. And he ran the German Air Force after the war in the 50s. So, apparently he wasn't just a diehard Nazi, as he was a great pilot. So,
and how that plays out and how that gets judged. So I guess that immediately leads me to the question of, given who is behind the plot here, again, this was our point of departure, the military apparatus, like you mentioned, the traditional, sort of Prussian aristocracy. How well are they going to sit with, they may understand why they have to be de-armed or are allowed only a limited form of armament. How are they going to sit with that, do you think?
I don't think they're going to like it at all. But see, I think they had a delusion they were working under, that if they killed Hitler and offered peace terms, that everything would be fine. And it just wasn't going to work. It just wasn't going to work.
Yeah, I agree. They have maybe they have just this. They have an idealistic thought about what can actually be achieved. Again, if we just get rid of the madman, certainly they'll recognize we got rid of the madman, and they'll let us keep our soldiers, right?
Yeah. We're not so bad as he was. That's why we killed him.
Right. and again, I think that's, so often I fall prey to this too. So I don't want to sound, judgmental about it, but it's so easy when you're thinking about alternative timelines to just assume the most rosy scenario in every instance. And, just reality doesn't work that way. And so, I think you're right. They may have been functioning under a understandable but diluted sense of what actually could have been accomplished. And so, in my mind, the two ways that you normally hear about a scenario where there's a different end is that, there's the one scenario, I think I may have already mentioned it. I know we talked about it off podcast. I think I mentioned it during the podcast recording here, is that, there's this idea that suddenly Germany would have joined with the United States and with Britain and would have, we know the problem, we know the long-term problem here. It's sort of the Patton approach to things in a lot of ways. We know the long-term problem here is the Soviets. So we're here, we're ready, we're armed, let's go. And, and Germany comes along because the long-standing, the hostility, basically that, yes, there still is an Eastern Front. Germany's our ally now. And I just find that to be, no, it's not going to happen.
Well, and look at the logistics of it too. Politically, you're right, definitely. But even looking at the logistics of it, we had been busy bombing German industry and destroying their ability to make bullets and tanks and airplanes, and a lot of that was wrecked. And Germany, they would have to, if we had tried this with their army, we would have had to rearm them with our weapons.
Right.
Because
are you suggesting somebody who said, is this a good idea or not?
Yeah, and plus by then, so many German soldiers had died that they were down to Volksgrenadier divisions that were, old guys and kids and, poorly armed, not enough artillery. I mean, they would have needed to have been completely equipped, and they were not trained all that well. They were rushed into the front, and while some of them gave good accountings of themselves, most of them, the I know I've read recently Rob Satino of the World War II Museum in New Orleans has written some great books on the Wehrmacht, and one thing he said was that they may have been able to defend pretty well, but they were not capable of attacking anything.
Right.
So.
So again, this idea of Germany joins the Great Western fight against the Eastern Soviet communists. I think that's also is equally in some ways diluted as a concept as the idea that, well, yeah, okay, you got rid of Hitler, we'll just let you keep everything and go back to the way things were before. So if that's the case, and you mentioned it's an occupied Germany, we touched on a little bit, we haven't fully gone there. So what do the Soviets want?
They want territory first. They want to grab as much as they can and turn it communist. That's their, in addition to the military objectives, the political objective is to make the world red. That was very much in their ideas. It certainly was for Stalin. So that's why I think they grabbed so much of Eastern Europe, and would have grabbed more if we hadn't said, okay, these are the lines and we're sticking to them, kind of thing. So, and at that point, the Soviet Union, yeah, they had great weaponry and lots of it, but they had lost several million soldiers too, and they were starting to run out of people. I think by late 45 into 46, they would have had trouble finding people, just like the Germans did, and the British too, by the way. Right. They were about out of people too.
So let's assume then that, again, Germany is confined back to its pre-war borders. The annexed territories are not included there. You have Poland restored to being Poland. Romania. There's a question about what happens in particularly like in the Czechoslovakia. That whole situation. That's just difficult because it's always been difficult. The way that states have been put together there that don't necessarily represent the ethnicities and the nationalities. But I think what I come around to is that, yes, you would have had, the main difference in this scenario would have been an earlier end of the war, which is good. Soldiers that lost their life. You mentioned, the risk that existed there, from folks in your family who were involved in the Battle of the Bulge.
Right.
That doesn't happen because it doesn't happen. But that ultimately, when you end up drawing the map of Europe now after World War II, it's different, but a lot of it is still the same, in the sense that you have still probably a heavy Soviet influence on most of Eastern Europe, not because they've occupied it, but because that's part of how things are settled out in terms of where things are going to be. And the major difference is, instead of having a divided Germany, an East and a West Germany, you have a united Germany that exists, but it's a disarmed, at least tamer, controlled, contained Germany. And that there's really not, again, when you draw the map of Europe after the war, it's not that substantially different, unless you're really looking at, okay, Germany's not two parts but one.
Well, maybe, they would still want to delineate occupation zones. I don't think they'd want to have both Soviet and Western Allied troops in the same cities. So there may have been a de facto line in Germany at some point where this is the Russian zone and this is the American and British zone. So I don't know how that would have played out. Then it would come to a point where, okay, it's 46 or 47 or 8. When do we leave? When
Right.
do we leave it back to the Germans? And of course, we've still got bases in Germany, even
Right.
now. So it's like, are we through occupying Germany yet, or what?
Right.
Uh,
And again, we've gone through the reunification of Germany, which I was just thinking about that in my head, how long that's actually been. That's 30 years ago now.
yeah,
I
yeah.
mean, it seems like it was yesterday, but it's it's been a while now. But to
And
your point, yeah, you might argue that in some ways Germany it's not occupied in the sense that it was in 1945 and 46, but there's still a very strong. They're a huge part of NATO. Obviously, there's still an American military presence that's there, even though technically, at least technically, the Cold War's over, right?
yeah, but I think they're really just they're still there for the Russians, even though I don't see the Russians doing much anytime soon. Uh, I don't think they're the number one threat anymore. Um, but anyway, I just don't believe that you know, we would want right after the war we would not want Germany to ever be able to do what they've done twice again.
Right.
You know,
To, to,
I
to,
think
to be the aggressor in a major conflict.
yeah, and they thought they had that nailed down after Versailles, and that didn't work. So now, after World War II, what do you do to make sure that the Germans don't get out of hand ever again? And I think time has passed to the point where uh, the Germany is starting to simmer a little bit again. Now they've had a leftist socialist government for a long time, and that's kind of kept everything down as far as the right. But there are rightist parties trying to make a little noise here and there in Germany now. So who knows? Another 50 years, it may happen again. Never know.
Yeah, well, the nature of the famous thing about history is those who don't study it are doomed to repeat it, which I think is true. But I think the
Yeah.
nature of history is the reason you're doomed to repeat it is history just tends to want to repeat itself.
Yeah.
It gets in loops for the reason that it gets in loops.
It's like my dad used to say, this world would be a wonderful place except for all the humans in it,
Right.
you know? So,
We mess it up. So
yeah.
so to me, one of the interesting things about a lot of historical what ifs is you can go down the what if path, and yes, it changes individual things, but at the end of the day, has there been enough of a change that you see a change of substance? And not to minimize, again, there were lives that were lost in the battles in the European theater in 44 and 45. That's true of American lives, British lives. There were certainly more Soviet lives that were lost, German lives that were lost. And so ending the war on or about July 20th in terms of being 44 being a shooting war makes a difference in history, because it makes a difference for somebody's grandfather, grandmother, whatever the case might be, brother or sister, whatever that might be. That's a real impact. But in terms of looking at the broad scope of history, the more I think this through in a realistic way, is I don't think it changes that much about the broad stroke of history.
Not really. Yeah, I think you're right. The war would have ended in 9 months anyway. So I think maybe they waited too long for the coup.
Right.
Uh,
Yeah.
yeah.
Again, if this had happened, I think it's an entirely different. You mentioned this was not the first plot. If you get something that changes, maybe that's a podcast episode for a different time, because it probably might have a different outcome. Is if you have a situation prior to D-Day, for example, where there's a change, where now you still have Fortress Europe, a fully occupied France, but now a change in German political and military leadership that is more open to coming to some form of accommodation. That accommodation may look very different before you've landed troops on the continent proper at
Yeah.
Normandy, and how that might play out. Because as you mentioned several times, I think correctly so, the leverage of the Allies in whatever negotiations happen here with a successful July 20th coup is the leverage still exists. We have troops here, and we can enforce this whether you agree to it or not.
Yeah. So it's still an unconditional surrender, really.
Correct. Versus, more of a negotiated peace, an accommodation, or an arrangement that comes into being, which still may have resulted from complete German withdrawal, for example, from France. That probably would have been a condition. I can't imagine the
Yeah,
Allies would have just let that stand. That's incomprehensible to me.
yeah.
But you certainly may have had a
The French units and the Allied forces would have objected to that for
yeah,
sure.
at least one Frenchman somewhere would not have been happy with that. And if there's,
Right. Hmm.
and it wouldn't have gone down, but it could have been very different in terms of what is allowed to be remain intact as far as the Germany that exists after there. Or if it happens earlier, the Soviets have not begun as much of their offensive actions now, moving back where they're on the push on the Eastern Front versus at a stalemate or being on the defensive. And if you change that calculus of what you can enforce at the negotiation table without going to now tremendous efforts to do so, you might change the outcome there. I could imagine a scenario there where you would have something that's slightly different if, a plot, I don't know which plot you'd pick, but if a plot had succeeded a year earlier or 9 months earlier, again, pre-invasion, pre-D-Day.
I think probably the only way it would have worked is if they had killed him prior to June of 41, before the invasion, before Barbarossa, invasion of the Soviet Union, because that was his big mistake.
Right.
So if they had killed him before he did that, then Stalin would have been contained, and the only places they would have had to have withdrawn from would be France, Belgium, and the Low Countries. And I think it might have worked, maybe, but
So easy summary, it's so easy to make history easy, right? The easy summary though is too little, too late.
Yeah.
To have a real change on the face of things after the war. Interesting conjecture, but at the end of the day, we still probably, I think, end up with a contested Europe. We end up with the Cold War. We end up with so much of what we know sitting here in 2020 that happens after 1944, even if we change the actual events of 1944.
right, yeah, it's just
Yeah,
it was a great idea to kill Hitler, but
yeah,
too little, too late.
And again, I don't know because I didn't go back and do this. And I'm a little embarrassed to say I didn't go back and do this. I don't know what percentage, for example, of the loss of life at concentration camps and other things that were part of that horrible part of World War II. How much of that occurred after July of 20? And again, even if one life is saved there, that's huge. And it could have been tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands. But from my recollection off the top of my head of most of history, while things certainly were bad in the very late stages of the war when it came to executions and genocide, much of the genocide had also already happened before July of 44.
Yes, true. They started that the day they invaded Poland. So,
right. I know in a lot of instances what happened late in the war, from my recollection, and correct me if I'm wrong, Sam, because you would know that if I'm a lot of instances where work camps then turned into executions or exterminations that weren't originally that, but that was only the consequence of we're retreating now, and what do we do with this situation? Well, unfortunately, we try to erase any evidence that this happened, that we had a concentration or work camp here, and so you had exterminations that happened there that would have been saved. But again, the vast majority, and I don't want to make light of even one life there, but the vast majority of what had happened with the atrocities and the genocide, again, is well before 44.
Well, they started out as work camps in the late 30s when Hitler would send his enemies to these camps, and then once they started invading territory, and of course the German Jews went to the camps initially since they were already in Germany, but then wherever they invaded, they just sent more people there. And then at some point, and it was pretty early on in 1940, perhaps, they started shooting people. This is before they did gas and everything. They were mass executions by firing squads. So it started pretty early, the genocide part.
Yeah. And again, back to if you're willing to do so, Sam, I think it might be a fun exercise to have you come back on to talk about that scenario where maybe, as you said, in pre-Barbarossa, if there had been someone who had, if this had happened, before the summer of 40, I think there is a lot more there. And again, just, back to what happens that we know in post-war, the post-war world, eventually what happens with, the repatriation of Jews to Palestine, the formation of modern Israel. A lot of that is motivated and does flow out of the events of World War II. It's not that
Right.
it wouldn't have happened otherwise, but I think you would have also potentially had a different path for that, that doesn't quite play out the same way. If you can go back far enough, and as you just mentioned there, you're not going to be able to go back far enough to totally avoid the genocide and the atrocities that are associated, and appropriately so, for the reason that Hitler is reviled. There's lots of reasons why, but most definitely that is a legitimate reason for him being reviled, and for that regime doing what they did. But if you can go back far enough to change some of that, I think that does have some impact on the general flow of history after the war.
Yeah, I agree. I think you back then in 1940, it would have been a lot easier to keep some of that secret if Germany had made peace early after a Hitler assassination, because nowadays you can't keep anything secret. But back
Right.
then, it you might have been able to. So
And,
especially if you shoot the witnesses, which they might have done. So
right. Well, and the other thing there, the other interesting flows of that are, think about the number of immigrants, not just to the United States, but to other parts of the world where, because of what happened, you know, where's an Albert Einstein in a different
right.
world where he doesn't have to flee? These things all, one of the other contributors, many of our listeners know, you may have listened to some of the episodes that Brent Frost has been on, that joined us there. One of the conversations we often have when Brent's on is, which form of history do you subscribe to? Sort of the great man, great woman theory of history, or to
Right.
more of, the general flow and large mass number. Going to make a reference here that some people may not be familiar with. It's what I think of as being the Asimov Foundation view of history. It's psychohistory. And for those of you that are familiar with
Right.
that science fiction,
Oh yeah, I read those a long time ago. Yeah.
yeah, ultimately it's just a specialized form of calculus. It's big numbers in play, and there's nothing you can really do to change much of that. And I do think that both of those are true. There are certainly individuals that at particular points in time can become the fulcrum points, but that generally it's tough to change the inertia of history because there's so much force in the aggregate that you have to change. And so, you can think about the historical what if of, the classic, we've said this often on the podcast, Alexis and I, if we ever do the show on what happens if JFK is assassinated, we've jumped the shark. Because that's an alternate history podcast version of a clip show, as one of the contributors mentioned a couple of weeks ago. Because you suddenly think, if you just you change that. By the way, whoever fired that bullet, that's a whole other interesting thing. But if you change
Right.
the course of that assassin's bullet in Dealey Plaza in November of '63, you suddenly change all kinds of things. Well, maybe because you're talking about the assassination of a president, but there were so many forces that were already in play for so many things that making that one change probably doesn't change that much, just because there's so much weight and inertia attached to everything else. And I think that's true. Again, Hitler is one of those points, you say, well, that's such a powerful figure that if you remove him, things have to be different. And the answer is yes, things do have to be different. But how different can they be given the forces that allowed him to rise in the first place, which you sort of referenced there, would be the same reasons why 40 or 50 years later, you might be back around to it no matter what.
Yeah, I mentioned this early on, back in I think it was 1917. Hitler was a corporal in the Bavarian army, part of the German army, and fighting in France, and he was a runner. And I think that they portrayed this in one of those World War II television series not too long ago. But he was running across no man's land, and a British private had him in his sights And since Hitler was unarmed, he was not, he was just running across a field. He didn't fire. and I don't know how they verified this, but can you imagine if he had shot Hitler in World War I? So talk about a what if.
Yeah, and again, I guess my point there, and I don't know that's a great thing to explore. You might say, okay, that changes history, but if there's not a Hitler, maybe we revile a different name who would have risen and done the exact same thing. Because
maybe Ernst Röhm, the head of the SA that he had killed in the Night of the Long Knives,
Yeah, because the realization is that we try very hard not to chase too many political things here on the show because it's chasing political things, but the realization is that it wasn't just because there was this one guy named Adolf Hitler that those atrocities that we mentioned here a few minutes ago were committed. There were others who shared that same point of view and were more than willing not only to go along with it, but if there's no Hitler, maybe they're the ones that instigate. And
yeah, it's quite possible. He had such a gift for speaking,
correct,
and persuading people and firing them up that it would have to be someone with a similar talent. But talk about Nazis that went along with Hitler. My dad was telling me that after the war, you couldn't find a Nazi in Germany. Like you'd say, "Oh, you helped him, didn't you?" No, I was never a Nazi.
Right. But we have your paperwork here from the party. Yes, but only because I had to, right?
I had to. They put a gun to my head. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's also the nature of what makes a lot of considering conjectural what ifs difficult is it's thinking down at that level. One of the things that I've be candid with you again, trying not to be political. One of the things I've struggled with in watching the politics of the last couple of decades is I never could fully understand how that worked in 1930s Germany, to be honest. How could an intelligent, educated, granted dealing with the post-World War I economic impacts of having lost a major war and what was imposed upon the country, how could people go along? That's the issue. How could people, and this is true throughout history, not just to contain it to 1930s Nazi Germany, but just in general, how could people go along? Well, they don't go along by making conscious decisions. Sometimes they go along just by rolling with the flow and the inertia that's there, and they choose not to stand against it.
Yeah, since if you think of yourself as being alive back then, you went through a horrible depression, probably worse than the one in America, and you get to the point where, hey, Hitler's the new chancellor, and I've got a job now. I can eat. I can feed my family now. And
right.
And if I join this army or that organization, SA or SS, then I can be a big man,
Right.
So it was very alluring,
Right, and that's why again, tying it back to what we do here instead of chasing the political philosophy thing, which Sam, I'm happy to talk with you about anytime. We've done that before.
Oh, sure, yeah.
Is the concept of that's why it's difficult when you do the historical what ifs to say, well, if you just change this one thing, it would have been different. As you talk about the economic forces that led to the rise of the Nazi Party in Germany were very real. And so whether it's Hitler that's leading that with maybe, again, as you said, with, obviously skills as an orator, you can't, you can totally disagree with everything that he said, but realize, okay, he was good at that because just see the results of that is, may have played out in a different way, but it wouldn't have played with a different person, but it may not have played out in a different way, I guess is what I'm saying in a real long-winded way. And so it's easy to assume it's possible that British private pulling the trigger could have changed everything, or he could have changed virtually nothing except the name of the person that we would be using here reviling that would have need to have a briefcase
Right.
explode in July 20th of 1944 would have been just a different guy with a different name who essentially was the same thing.
Yeah, you're probably right on that one. Would have been great to get rid of Hitler, though.
Yeah, exactly. And there may be more Adolfs running around the world today as a result too. Just as just
That's
the casual
true.
things.
I saw that film too. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Sam, do you have anything else you want to think about in terms of the what if here before we close it out?
No, other than just a general congratulations on the topic and the philosophy itself as far as what ifs go. I've been doing what ifs for a long time, mostly through wargaming, simulation gaming, and things like that. It's like, you get the actual forces of whatever historical period, and you're in command, and you get to pick. Do you win or do you lose, and how do you do it? And so this is great. I like the concept.
I appreciate that, Sam. I'm glad you're able to join us. And if you're willing to come back, we're certainly willing to have you back. And I know particularly when it comes to, because of what you just described, their military history in particular. And I know you are very capable of talking about another form of history near and dear to both of us, which is Texas history. If we ever go back there with some more things than we have, certainly have you back for that. So, Sam, I appreciate you joining us. I think this has been a good exploration, and I look forward to having you back. So having done that, thank you. So having done that, we're going to close out the episode here. Again, I'm going to thank Sam. I'm going to thank listeners, because we always do like to thank you. We know that you have lots of things you could do with your time, and listening to Sam and I ramble on may be something that's enjoyable to do with your time, but at least you gave us your time, even if you didn't enjoy it. So we appreciate that. We'd invite you to visit our website, www.aforkandtimepodcast.com. As Alexis and I always say, the A is important there and the podcast is important there to get you there. If I could have just locked down forkandtime.com, I would have, but wasn't available. So go there. You'll find our entire back catalog of episodes, ways to provide feedback on the show. Sam, I'll just share this with you. We've been doing this for a little over a year now. And so we get more of our listeners that, either provide comments or make suggestions for topics. And so the episode that will come next, I'm going to go ahead and put this in here now, because I've already edited the episode that will come after this, which is one that Alexis and I recorded. But I'll go ahead and give listeners a preview here. She and I recorded a couple of days ago when she was in town over the holiday weekend, and we recorded an episode. The next episode that'll be released after this episode is going to focus on the 1485 Battle of Bosworth in English history. We often go to English history because my daughter has a tremendous love of that. So we do this this whole episode on what would have happened if Richard III had been successful in 1845 at the Battle of Bosworth. Literally the next day, I get an email that's come in through our suggestion comment section from a listener saying, really enjoy the show. And I've always wanted somebody to go back to 1485 and talk about a different outcome of the Battle of Bosworth. So just looking here going, did I accidentally post the episode? Wait a second, this is too coincidental to be coincidental, but it was coincidental. So just spoiler alert, the next episode is going to focus on that. And I cannot remember the listener's name now, so I'll mention it on a future episode. But that listener is not the inspiration for that, because we had already recorded it before he inspired it. But it does sort of indicate that a lot of us that think about alternate history sometimes think alike. So if you were out there thinking about, gee, what would have been like if the 20 July 1944 plot had succeeded, you now don't need to go and make a comment, but we sort of knew you were going to do it anyway, I guess is my point. So so we invite our listeners to go and comment there and give us the feedback. We certainly appreciate it. So we're going to close out now. Sam, I'm going to say thank you again. And we like to close our podcast by borrowing, I know you're a huge baseball fan, which is a whole other thing we can talk about, some sports what ifs. But we've adapted Yogi Berra's famous, if you hit a fork in the road, take it. We've taken that here for our sort of one of our themes here for the historical what ifs and the nature of our podcast. If you encounter a historical fork in time, our suggestion is that you take it. Thanks.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more about the podcast at www.aforkandtimepodcast.com. Join us next time.